BCL. So MA because I'd done the BA.
BA in jurisprudence.
In jurisprudence. That's why I got the MA, then of course BCL, and then taught at Trinity.
And then?
Taught at Trinity.
Okay. Got that bit. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and we're delighted to have you here for this very interesting conversation on India's leadership role with the world. We have with us today Dr. Salman Khurshid, who served as the Foreign Minister of India in several previous administrations and is now a senior member of the Indian Supreme Court Bar, as well as a member of India's opposition Congress Party. We were also to be joined at this conversation with by Mr. P. Chidambaram, who is former finance minister of India. Unfortunately, Mr. Chidambaram was not able to be here today. He made it into Heathrow yesterday, but had to turn around and take the same flight back because his son has been detained in India on an unrelated charge. And so we wish him all the best, and we hope to be able to welcome Mr. Chidambaram here at the school on another occasion. But we're delighted to have Mr. Khurshid join us for this conversation. Let me give you a few quick words of introduction. Firstly, my name is Karthik Ramanna. I'm a professor of business and public policy here and the director of the MPP, the Masters in Public Policy. Our guest, Mr. Khurshid, is, as I said, the former foreign minister of India. But more importantly, he is a graduate of this great university, having received the BA in jurisprudence and the BCL, and having taught for 3 years at Trinity College. Is that right? Trinity College. And he went to Teddy Hall, for those of you who are affiliated with either or both of those colleges. With that, so the format for today, Mr. Khurshid will speak for about 20 or 30 minutes uninterrupted, and then we'll take questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and wait for the mic to come to you. This event is being streamed on YouTube, so it's important that you speak into the mic and obviously say who you are before you ask your question. But we'll get to that in due course. Take it away, sir.
Thank you very much. Always delighted to be back where one learned much of what I've used in my life, my career. Of course, the Oxford that I knew was different from the Oxford that's evolved. And many of you are here at the cutting edge of modern times in Oxford. And it's good to be interacting with you in such wonderful surroundings. We are to speak on India's role in the world, India's relationship with the world, and I think it's a subject that includes, in many ways, for many of us, and I hope I'll be able to persuade you too, that the world as a stage is available to any country that has the capacity, capability, the size, and the ambition to reach the world. But you cannot do a great deal in the world unless you're doing something good at home. And that's the critical formula that many countries sometimes forget. And certainly, I imagine that India will have to keep in mind if we genuinely hope to achieve something in the world. Now, this is not like China that went through many intense phases. First the revolution, the Red Revolution, by which China turned into a different country from what it was known to be, around the same time as India became independent. And again, not in the manner in which China became insular and preoccupied with the Cultural Revolution. It is only beyond the Cultural Revolution that China began to spread itself, and in recent terms has reached out to areas in the past that China had completely kept itself away from. Today, for instance, when people worry about the possibility of the United States forces withdrawing from the West Asian region, whether that would leave a gap. And they immediately get a response that amongst the countries that would be willing to partially, if not substantially, fill that gap would be China. And that China has both the capacity and the will to do that. Across the vast continent of Africa, in terms of the enormous potential of exploitation of its mineral wealth, what are the countries that are coming in after the retreat of the imperial powers and after the retreat of colonial powers is, again, countries like China. In contrast, of course, India has a traditional presence in Africa, a traditional presence that was fortified by the attitude of Mahatma Gandhi, having come from Africa to fight the British Empire and to seek freedom within our own country, but remain committed to where he started the initial movement, and that was in South Africa. And Nehru, who followed in his footsteps, to speak of independence as being incomplete in 1947, independence being incomplete till such time as our friends and associates in Africa didn't get their independence. And so India, unlike China, has traditionally been engaged with vast parts of the world. The Afro-Asian Conference, for instance, in Bandung, the first conference soon after India became independent, is a conference that clarified India's continued interest in Africa and parts of Asia that India saw in its larger neighborhood. And that's the time when China had no such impulses, and China had no such messages to send to the world. India deeply engaged in the very, very prolix problem of Palestine, for instance. India being in a position where Yasser Arafat traveled to India in the Nam movement and embraced Indira Gandhi and said, "She's like my daughter." So it wasn't that India wasn't to be seen anywhere. India was everywhere, virtually omnipresent in terms of the Nam movement, with Tito, with Nasser, saying to the world, emerging out of the World War, that India could provide, along with countries like Egypt and Yugoslavia, India could provide a base and a platform for countries that didn't want to align with any superpower, whether it was the Russian superpower, the Soviet Union, or the various organizations, military organizations that were sponsored by the United States of America. But, of course, India had natural inclination towards the Soviet Union. I think we should honestly admit to that. And it had natural inclination to the Soviet Union because of many reasons, one being, largely, being the Indian leadership's great romantic association with the idea of an equal society and an egalitarian society, and what the Russian Revolution had offered, or the Great Revolutions had offered. And therefore, India had an inclination towards the Soviet Union, but it was more than that. It was also that the growing Indian economy needed markets, and the growing Indian economy needed fuel. And fuel was supplied by Russia, supplied by Russia in a trade pact where India had to pay in rupees, and India could then send back whatever it produced into the East European markets. Similarly, to protect itself, particularly beyond 1962, India could get weapons from the Soviet Union and not to have to pay for those weapons in what is known as hard currency, but could pay for it in rupees. And therefore, despite India's ambition and clear perception that the world could not be divided into two superpowers, India did have some practical and principled reasons for appreciation and association with the Soviet Union. But the idea of freedom and democracy, which was equally important to the Indian leadership, soon after independence was something that they saw in a great deal and were inspired by from countries like Ireland, countries like the UK, countries like the USA. And much of our jurisprudence of freedom, therefore, falls back on the jurisprudence that we got from the UK and the USA. And the Constitution itself has provisions that were inspired by the Irish Constitution. So India was always there in the world. But the big question is, was India ever seeking to be a superpower? Now, there are many definitions of superpower, but the simplest definition of superpower is that you have military prowess to be able to influence events in any part of the world, which is what we have seen superpowers do repeatedly over the decades since the Second World War. Whether that's necessarily a good thing, I doubt. If there would be many votes in favor of that proposition. We know what has happened to the world today. We've seen what's happened in the Middle East. We've seen what's happened with Iraq. We've seen what's happened with Afghanistan. And possibly, we have seen what almost happened in Europe. But finally, after enormous amount of pain, it settled down in the Balkans. Is that the kind of superpower India wants to be? And I do believe that you may have someone else come from India and say to you that that's the superpower we want to be. But you need to ask the question that if you want to be that kind of superpower, how long will it take for you to be that kind of superpower compared to your neighbor, China, both in terms of the economic strength and in terms of the present military strength, including the nuclear arsenal? Where are we and where is China? Can we honestly and practically believe that we could play the role of a superpower, even in Asia, forget about the world? Can we play a role of a superpower in the near future? My answer is no. But does that mean that we need to retreat and be a recluse? And does that mean that we should become introverts? And my answer there is no. We have something unique and special that African leaders would tell you China doesn't have. China goes with muscle, China goes with money, China goes with engineering skills. But no matter how strong and powerful that impact may be and that draw may be, India offers something unique, often described as the soft power of India. And that, I do believe, goes back to the very thought processes of Mahatma Gandhi, the strength and the vitality of his idea of satyagraha, or his idea of the power of truth, followed by a larger approach of Indian diplomacy that has been touched by a special spirituality and special commitment to peace and harmony and rejection of violence. For a long time, India resisted the pressure to become a nuclear weapon power simply because it didn't fit into India's scheme of things. But forced by what was happening in the neighborhood, India became a nuclear power. But despite becoming a nuclear power, it remained committed to a nuclear-free world. And the only blueprint of a nuclear-free world that has been placed in the United Nations has been placed by India. Now, one might ask that, in order to achieve the success of such a blueprint would depend on what kind of voluntary nuclear disarmament any country is prepared to do. Would India be prepared for such a far-reaching step? But perhaps that's a question that will get answered in due course, maybe not today. Given that that's the general context of India's approach to the world, where do we stand today? Where do we stand today, and what is it that we can do in the years to come? Today, India is headed by a government of a leader who has a very special vision for the world and who has a sense of a significant presence in the world for India. Not very different from Nehru. Not in terms of his energy, his outreach, and his desire to make friends across the globe, not in a sense different from Nehru, but entirely different in style. Nehru's style was sophisticated. His style was extremely subtle, cultured, attractive. Whereas the style of our present Prime Minister is aggressive. It's proactive. It's full of energy, full of vitality, reaching out to the globe, not simply as Nehru did to peoples of the globe, but reaching out today to a changed globe where the large and important democracies of the world and important countries of the world, even that are not democracies, are perhaps countries of a different nature, but have vast numbers of overseas Indians who influence local policy, influence local performance, and who can provide a special platform for special connectivity with India. And that's the critical mass that's being approached by the present Prime Minister. First time that we've seen in the world that a visiting Prime Minister holds rallies in those countries of 100,000 people, 200,000 people, and even in a country like China, which is extremely, extremely careful about giving public platforms, our Prime Minister was able to hold a rally of several hundred thousand people. So it's a whole new ball game and a whole new style that he offers to the world. And the world is responding. And the biggest reason why the world is responding today is because of the Indian market. The world needs markets. It needs places to go and invest in. And that is an offer that comes from India, apart from the offer of China. India seems to be the obvious part of a strategy where world investment doesn't want to be put into one basket, but want somewhat an ability to hedge their investments between one country and another. And therefore, India poses as a remarkable and a very attractive alternative destination for investment. But the big question is for us in India, and I do believe that for some of us in the party to which I belong, we are deeply, deeply concerned, is that you can't have a face in the world which is different from the face that you have at home. If you have trouble at home, you can never, never, despite all the attractive propositions that you give to the world, and despite all the need that the world feels for you, have a sustainable connectivity with the world that not only gives you space, stature, and presence, that could count you as one of the significant powers in the world, and I don't want to use superpower, but significant powers in the world, and yet hope, and yet not address matters and things at home that are fundamental to democracy. The biggest challenge that we feel in terms of democracy in India today is that there is a national consensus that India arrived at the time of our independence, reflected in our constitution. And if you read our constitution, you read the direct principles of the constitution, you read what the constitution purported to do, and you read the backdrop in which that constitution was given to the people of India, and the speech that Nehru made when he said that many years ago we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes to redeem the pledge. When the whole world sleeps, India shall wake to freedom. That speech and the Gandhian thought that went the backdrop of that constitution, and the constitution that has given us the strength, the power, the perseverance to face challenges, including the challenge of curtailing democracy under Indira Gandhi, that everybody believes was unjustified, but was then supported by the Supreme Court, more recently rejected by the Supreme Court in a curious incident in which a previous judge, Chief Justice Chandrachud, who finally became the Chief Justice, party to upholding of the emergency legislation that did away with habeas corpus, has today been overruled several decades later by his son, Justice Chandrachud, on the Supreme Court. First time anywhere in the world that a son as a judge has overruled a judgment of his father as a judge. But that's the critical thing that has happened in India. And while that's happening, and the institution has been a remarkable institution that has seen us through some very, very difficult challenges, challenges of civil strife, challenges of rebuilding the nation after independence and partition of India, challenges of food shortages, challenges of water conflicts, challenges of internal subversion, challenges of questioning of India's sovereignty by neighbors, etc. The constitution that allowed us to do that, and to do that keeping liberty intact, is a constitution that we have associated with a particular idea of India, which is inclusive, which is secular, which is liberal, and which is an example to all democratic countries in the world. And yet, today, because of the working of the electoral system and the working of democracy, there's a major question mark that's put on that idea of India. And another idea of India is emerging, or has emerged in recent years, and we don't know whether that can be sustained through elections one after the other, or is it just a passing phase that will then revert back to the original idea of India, is the big question. My proposition is that if the idea of India itself remains unstable, if the idea of India itself remains surrounded by questions, for India to project itself as a significant participant in world affairs across the globe, perhaps would not be as easy as some of us have assumed for years it to be. Today we sit in G20. Today we are sought after for many, many issues, economic, political, and social, many issues of global security, of climate change, and we play a very significant role in all of them, in the evolving economic governance of the country, of the world, and indeed the future of the United Nations. But would we be able to sustain our presence if we are unable to sustain the idea of India at home, is the big question for us. And I will leave that for you to think about, and perhaps to ask supplementary questions that would clarify the idea further in terms of your understanding of the problems that face the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll take questions in a couple of minutes, but I thought the central point to your argument, which is about balancing the situation at home with the image you project abroad, prompted me to think about this saying that is attributed to Louis XVI, perhaps apocryphally, at the time of the French Revolution, when France was in danger of losing its colonies in what is now Canada. He said, well, when the house is on fire, you must let the stables burn. And I wonder if there's an element of that to what you're saying. But I want to come back to this notion, and I want to tie it into something very central to the audacious experiment that is the Blavatnik School. So we're trying to build here a community that reimagines what it means to build effective government for the 21st century. And if we were doing this perhaps 20 years ago in the early 90s, when for a brief moment it appeared that Frank Fukuyama was right and that we were indeed at the end of history and that liberal democracy and free market society had triumphed, this would have been a less interesting venture. But we're doing it today, and we're doing it in a moment when the whole post-World War II consensus on what the purpose of society and the way we organize our economic activity has come undone. And there are some genuine questions about the credibility of the liberal democratic model in the world ahead. We've seen, for instance, in Turkey, Erdogan say, democracy is a streetcar that you ride to your next destination, and when you get there, you get off. Right? And we've seen recently President Xi in China revise the constitution to allow him to run for a third term. Lots of changes happening that are building sort of this alternative, perhaps strongman style of government. My own home country, the United States, some would argue has a strongman president. If you were, having lived the experience of the last 70 years of Indian democracy, if you were, in fact, to have the opportunity to have another tryst with destiny, to quote Nehru, and redesign Indian democracy or Indian systems of government today, would you once again go with the democratic model? And if so, what is the most affirmative case you can make for a liberal democracy, for an emerging market society in the world today?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that we haven't picked any extreme model either in democracy or in the political economy of our country. We spoke of a mixed economy even in the heyday of Indian socialism, where banks were nationalized, where there was strict licensing system for manufacture, there were price controls, and then we reached a point where weddings could not be held without a restriction on the number of guests that you could invite and the menu that you could offer. We actually reached a level where controls had to be so extensive and extreme. But that's because there were extensive food shortages, and this is before PL 480 and so on was introduced, and the United States came in and helped us with the grain. Yet there were, the university education was state-controlled and state-owned. There were no private universities. Private universities are something of recent vintage, and some of them are outstanding, very good. But we still don't have complete clarity about private universities in an extensive way compared to the public sector universities. But as far as the economy is concerned, reforms under the Congress government led by Mr. Narasimha Rao and then subsequently, of course, led by Dr. Manmohan Singh, extensive reforms of the economy, the licensing system, control systems have gone. Regulations have come in, modern regulators have come in, economy is free. More and more areas of the economy that were monopolized by the state have been moved out and opened up to the private sector. The airlines, for instance, now are largely in the private sector. Air India is soon to be sold off to the private sector of the government is to be believed, and so on and so forth. Many public services, again, are being privatized. And that's something that seems to have inevitably been accepted, but not necessarily widely supported and appreciated by the population. So we never really did anything in an extreme form. As far as democracy is concerned, I think the maximum areas of democracy, though articulated in the Constitution, were not at the ground level implemented. Whether it was in terms of election reform, that took time, or it was in terms of fundamental things like freedom, dignity, freedom of choice, autonomy of existence. It's only this year that we now have a constitutional bench judgment of the Supreme Court saying that privacy is a fundamental right. Now, all these years, India has had fundamental rights, the right of freedom, the right of autonomy, etc., but it could not be articulated, even by the Supreme Court, as a broad, sweeping commitment to privacy. And we do believe that having committed itself to privacy, the Supreme Court will now open up a huge number of challenges, including the challenge to people who are sexually differently inclined, something that was a criminal offense in our country, upheld by the High Court, by the Supreme Court in the past to be a criminal offense. So I do believe that the only way, and the horrible experience of partition, on which I'm to speak later in the evening today at the Oxford Union, the horrible experience of partition persuaded us that the only way we would succeed as a country is by fundamentally being democratic, so that you give accommodation and inclusiveness to all kinds of people. But democracy by itself was not enough, so we put in place affirmative action. I say that very broadly speaking, but basically the quota system, so the disenfranchised of the past, the disinherited, as it were, of the past, were to be included in the growth patterns of the country, and that's where we brought in reservations. So we restructured society and made it so at one end we said untouchability had to go, and the other end we had to say affirmative action for the post-untouchability period so that people could be included. I believe democracy was inevitable, and I do believe that nobody would seriously rethink the democratic experiment of India. But what might be worth examining is the unhappy circumstances thrown up by first past the post form of government in our country, or form of elections, and perhaps borrow a leaf from the democratic book of South Africa, and look seriously at the list system and proportional representation, because the all or nothing manner in which first past the post gives you a government, where people with 30% of the popular vote can get up to 2/3 majority in Parliament, and therefore steamroll every other point of view. I think that's something that needs to be addressed. And I will, with candor, admit to you that we were able to rule the country at 33 or 35% vote for a very long time, with great majorities, the Congress Party, and we assumed that it would never change for us. But now somebody else is doing the same thing, and I think it therefore becomes important that we rethink this whole process and stop using democracy as a vehicle that takes you from destination A to destination B, and then you get off it. I think we need to stay on the vehicle and take it past destination B by ensuring that representative democracy, as against mere participatory democracy, participatory being once in 5 years, representative and ongoing participation through a list system and through a proportional representation might give us a better model and maybe give us greater security for the idea of India. Otherwise, every time 30% decide to vote differently, the idea of India will have to be changed. And I think changing the idea of India every 5 years is a horrible thing for any country.
Fantastic. Great. So let's open it up for questions. Again, if you have a question, raise your hand, wait for the mic to come to you, state who you are, and what we'll do is take 2 or 3 questions at a time so that we can gather them. So we've got a couple questions right up front here.
Thank you. So you began your talk by saying that we cannot
Sorry, state who you are.
Sorry. Yeah. I'm Alifia. I'm doing my master's in women's studies at the university, Oxford University. You began your talk by saying that we cannot rule the world, or we cannot be a leader in the world unless we set an example at home. And you also spoke about, you emphasized on the need for peace, which brings me to the point of the religious divide that we are having as of today, and which is only increasing with time, unfortunately. How do we deal with the deep-rooted hatred that is sinking in, and sinking into the level of schools? Even amongst children, there is discrimination on religion. How do you think that's ever going to be uprooted? I mean, do you think it can be uprooted, and how can we change that? Because that's very, very dangerous.
Okay, we'll take the next row over there, Anna.
Thank you very much for that talk, sir. I'm Shuchi from, I'm doing my master's in water science, policy and management. And you mentioned climate change, and I've always been impressed at the way India has conducted itself in a very, in a manner that is very befitting the power and the leadership role that the country has had. And the past two environment ministers have played a huge role in the way the Paris Agreement has been articulated now. And I would like to know what's your opinion on how this should be taken forward now that the agreement has been signed, but the US has pulled out, and what would India's role in leadership as a leader, and has been a leader since Indira Gandhi's time, and how would that role change, if at all, and could India fill in a place of being a soft power that you think we are?
Yeah. Okay, so let's take those two questions and then we'll come to some more. So the first one is on deep-rooted hatred and how we might address that, and then one on climate change.
Now, I believe that the presentation and the pictures that we see of discord, let me describe it only as discord between communities in India in recent times is contrived. I do not believe, and I have good reason to say this, having traveled vast parts of India periodically, that Indians are not of that frame of mind, but they are variously either stunned into silence or paralyzed by turn of events that they are unable to analyze and understand. But fundamentally, vast majorities of Indians do not subscribe to this, do not approve of it, and are not comfortable with it. But there's a tilting point that needs to come for them to stand up and say enough and no more of this. Everyone is caught up in a system, and therefore it's only the very bold or the very active who stand up and speak. And some outstanding organizations are standing up and speaking as though they are speaking against their own religious communities, because they believe that there is no such thing as speaking only for a religious community. So I am optimistic that this will change, and I do believe that this is the worst of the poison that could have come out. And what happens in a society, any society, is when something terrible like this manifests itself, the society, as a body does when it heals itself, the society does things to heal. There, of course, there are examples of how legislation and government action intervenes and interferes, etc. But ultimately, it's the society that heals itself, and I do believe Indian society will heal itself. What we need is the right kind of leadership at this point. We need someone like Gandhi who is not seen as saying good things to get into power. We've had a bad experience with a lot of people who say good things to get into power rather than say good things for themselves and stop there. We need people. We need people to reach out and say to India and wake India's true spirit and soul to say that this is not something that we will accept. And I do believe that that will happen. I think a little bit of that is beginning to happen already, but in the near future, something like that will happen in the country. I am absolutely certain that that's the case. Now, as far as specific democratic steps that can be taken, I think it's important that people who believe that something is going wrong must give up some political ambition and create space which is inclusive so that everyone can come together and say, this is not a moment about selection of who will run governments, but this is a moment in which we have to consolidate the idea of India. And once the idea of India is consolidated, protected, and preserved, then somebody will be thrown up to run government. I think, therefore, this is, for our generation, a very, very critical moment and a very critical choice. And I hope we make the right choice for your generation, which has to come and take the torch. As far as climate change is concerned, I think India's commitment to climate change remains. I think we've done what we can do. We have, of course, a serious concern, and that was expressed in the reservations that were presented when the agreement was being worked upon, and that is that you've got to have the space to allow a developing country or a developing society to achieve acceptable levels of development. And for that reason, if we have to forego on certain parameters, then we need to be compensated. And I think that's really the problem with the United States of America, that the United States of America has felt uncomfortable under the new regime to compensate those who still need to catch up. And I think this is a deep disappointment and failure of Indian foreign policy, that we assumed that we were on the same side, and we assumed that we were going to be great friends, and that everything that we wanted, the United States would deliver. And the United States felt that everything they wanted, we would deliver. But this shows the critical difference between the United States and India, why we were never, in terms of relationships, like the Soviet Union and India. But we had, despite Nehru's and Kennedy's being the greatest of admirers of each other, that there were some intrinsic practical problems which could not make us be on the same page all the time. But we could still be friends, and we could still be partners, not allies critically, but partners. And I think this is the challenge of Indian foreign policy, is how do we work around the United States and say that it is not that we are deserting you, it is not that we are hostile to you, but as friends we need to tell you that these are things that you need to do to keep your position in the world today as the top power and as the most admired power in the world. It's not the experiment of sending troops with which you will gain your stature, but it is with the sacrifice, if it's a sacrifice at all, that you need to make to get and retain the stature that you want. So America will be great not by cutting off everything to the world, but America will be great by letting the world become great too.
Okay, we have a question out in the back there, Jolie. No, getting to you in a moment. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Thank you for that insightful talk. I'm Nishad. I'm doing South Asian politics at the Area Studies Department here. So my question was regarding what you mentioned about India not being a superpower, but a significant power. So recently, I mean, analysts sort of think that there's a gap between how the world sees India and how India sees what India's perception of self is. So, for example, Trump's national security strategy alludes to an Indo-Pacific instead of an Asia-Pacific, sort of thinking that India should take a bigger stance in that region. So I was just wondering whether you think that in the future India would sort of close that gap. Do you think India would take a bigger stance in the Indo-Pacific? Currently, there's, for example, talks of a quadrilateral alliance of democracies coming up with India, Japan, US, and Australia sort of coming together. Do you think that there's a future in something like that? Thank you.
Okay, and we have a question right a couple rows ahead.
Hello, yeah, thank you for your lecture. So I'm an academic visitor from China. You just speak,
your
you
name?
have China, yeah?
No, name.
Yeah, in here, my name is Chen, yeah.
Nice.
And an academic visitor in China Center of Oxford University, yeah. And you have just spoke of China several times. So we know there exists some border conflict between China and India, so which influences the relationship between China and India. And so, and on the other hand, so there are many, there exists a cooperation between India and China, but India reject to support the One Belt and One Road initiative. So my question is, why why does India government reject to support the initiative? Yeah, and could you give some comments on Sino-Indian relationship? Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. So we've got 2 questions already on security. Are there other questions on security? Maybe we'll take a couple more. So right one up here, Jolie, and then, yeah.
Thank you, sir, for joining us here today. My name is Sohail. I'm a graduate student over in the U.S. at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. My question is regarding the common thread that you have throughout your talk about what I suppose political scientist Joseph Nye would call soft power, and how India can exert soft power. My question, though, is in the specific context of India's backyard in Kashmir and Pakistan. How do you think that India can use soft power in a systematic way in that particular theater, especially when overtures by China have far more tools of hard power in their arsenal, whether it's a Security Council seat at the UN or whether it's the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? Thank you.
Great. So you have 3 rich security questions. So one about closing the superpower gap, one on One Belt, One Road.
The superpower gap that you've talked about, what is it that India can do in response to American perception or expectation of outreach in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm not sure that that's a perception that the United States of America has as being India-centric. Is it India-centric or US-centric? Is it something that they expect us to do for them in return for what? We don't know. Not H-1B visas, which we didn't get. So I think there is a problem there about misalignment of expectations between the US and ourselves. And I think that requires a greater clarity and a mutual understanding of where we come from, each of us. And I think it would be unfair of the US to expect that things that it doesn't want to do itself now, it would want India to do for it. Things are not easy for us. I mean, the Indian Ocean is called the Indian Ocean. The Maldives is part of SAARC. Maldives is a very good friend and has been traditionally very closely linked with India. But we don't know how to react to what's happening in Maldives. There is a very historically a very close relationship between the opposition leader, the former president, and India. And yet India is having enormous problem responding in a manner that would both reflect our understanding of the problem in Maldives, our perception of the future of Maldives and democracy in Maldives, and indeed aligning with the expectations of the United Kingdom and the USA. So I think that we have to think out of the box a bit and think about what we believe is the right thing to do in our region, and then let people come and align with that rather than accept a framework that's been laid out by somebody else and for us to say, well, we'll fit in simply because we want to be part of the big club and therefore we'll do that for you. And I think that's not really fair for India. As far as China is concerned, allow me to say that we have completely miscalculated and misunderstood China. You have a remarkable thing happening in your top leadership. The inscrutable Chinese leadership is now changed into an extremely conversational leadership that is capable of and willing to respond and react much as the rest of the countries have done over the years. And I think this has been misunderstood in India as greater willingness of China to give up its standard positions. And I think that's wrong. We may want you to give up some standard positions, but we then have to persuade you to give up those positions and also convince you that giving up those positions does not in any way compromise your national interest. Because after all, we all do foreign policy as an extension of our national interest and our perception of national interest. The only difference can be that national interest can be very narrow and national interest can be enlightened. And for this, you need a conversation. My own view is, and I can't absolutely prove it, but my instincts tell me that our conversations between the Chinese leadership and the Indian leadership in the recent months have been very formal. They have been very superficial, and they haven't really moved forward to a better understanding between the leaders. There are a lot of standard problems that remain. Leaders don't always control every level at every time and every moment. You have the PLA that may have a mind of its own, may have a strategy of its own, and it may take time for a leadership position to filter down to the PLA to say, you're interfering with a remarkable new relationship that's emerging. And we must understand, if that happens, that it will take time to filter down to every level. We have the same problem with bureaucracy in India, that simply because a leader at the top wants something done, that the bureaucracy will click its heels and do it immediately, may not be the case. So I do believe that if China and India both are convinced that the 21st century is a century for collaboration between India and China, we should work towards it. But it's not something that can be done in an instance. It's something that we'll have to work very steadily for a long time. We are both very old civilizations, and therefore there are no cash and carry shops available in our diplomacy. We'll just have to do something assiduously, carefully, patiently, and sustain it for a period. And only then can something happen. Now, I think we may have an undue suspicion about your ambitions for One Belt, One Road. I think we may have some undue suspicion. It may have something to do with your continued collaboration with Pakistan. But again, I think that we need to talk to you instead of just getting upset that you continue to help Pakistan. I think we need to talk to you. And that's what the whole test of statesmanship is. A statesman is a person who solves a difficult problem, and therefore to say, leave the problem simple so that I can be statesman, you're not saying the right thing, right? So we have complicated problems, but I think we have enormous potential for growth. What we need to do for China, to tell you the truth, is to create a huge amount of a support base for Chinese industry and Chinese business and investment in India, and make that a very critical part of your strategy for future. That if you have your investments in India, vast investments in India, it would be a different way in which you would look at India. Right now, there is growing trade, but the imbalance of trade in your favor is something that we can't see any simple way of correcting. So the answer really lies in letting China come in investment in a big way, and that will make people think differently. Now, if you're investing in Gwadar, if you're investing in the corridor in Pakistan, well, we should allow you to invest twice that amount in a corridor in India. But that means that we have to perceive you in a different light. And that means that you have to be willing to be a little more objective about what the opportunities India offers as compared to what Pakistan offers.
And we have a question on soft power in Kashmir. And
oh,
Pakistan.
Yeah, soft power. I didn't want to escape that. Soft power is, I think that it's a difficult thing to say, but I believe that we just haven't used soft power enough. I think we don't have enough confidence in soft power. Although we have great capacity for soft power, we have instinct for soft power, but I don't think we have confidence in soft power. Singing a song and looking at a semi-automatic rifle, anyone can get confused saying the power lies in the rifle, not in the song. But I do believe that soft power songs can do a lot more. And may I just put it like this: we haven't sung enough songs to Kashmir that we should have. Not easy. It's not easy. But if we really care, for humanity and we really care for Kashmir, I think that's what we need to do. There are people who've periodically attempted to do that. And I believe there's an enormous potential to unleash there. But we should. Now, the trouble with Kashmir is that the moment you talk about Kashmir, people say there are more parties than you are willing to talk about. That you're prepared to talk about 2 parties. And even there, in one party, you want to truncate it into these are extremists and these are possible negotiators and so on. There are many parties involved in Kashmir. You don't have to get them all at the same table, but we have to talk to all parties who are involved using different instruments of conversation. But and then maybe one day bring the conversation together to one table. But the conversations must continue. The soft power for Kashmir that we need is essentially conversation. And conversation not between former raw agents and people, but between people and people. How can we create conversations between people and people, between sons and daughters and sons and daughters, between students and students? I think that's it, but it's a complicated task, and it requires full-time attention.
Okay, thank you. So there was a question out in the back there.
Hi, my name is Prakhar. I'm an alumni of the Blavatnik School and currently working with a think tank in Bombay. My question is more on the lines of non-state actors. So Joseph Nye at Harvard, talks about power diffusion, and because of lowered barriers to entry, non-state actors throughout countries have a huge role to play in determining foreign policy and therefore leadership of state actors in the world. So one statistic that sort of stands out is Al-Qaeda in 2011 killed more Americans than Japan did in Pearl Harbor in 1941. And that sort of tells you on the amount of power these non-state actors hold. Therefore, my question is twofold. One, what are the non-state actors that you think that India needs to deal with, both inside and outside, at a more abstract level? And the second, could you share an anecdote where you sort of negotiated with some non-state actor and what that really looks like? Because for countries, there are ambassadors, but how do you talk to these guys? Thank you.
Okay, great. And then we have a question here in the blue jacket. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. It's been really fascinating. My name is Lisa. I'm doing a postdoc here at the Blavatnik. I work in climate change. I'm from the Caribbean, so I wanted to push a little bit more on the comments about climate change. I've attended some of the negotiations, and I've, behind closed doors, heard some comments from the Minister of the Environment from India that were not very progressive. And so I asked this question because your response is really in that dialectic that's been going on for many decades between developed and developing countries, which is not really getting us anywhere. And although I believe there are significant equity issues from very vulnerable states, they're not going to be resolved probably within the time frame that we need them to be resolved within. And so I was wondering, with the absence of the United States, India sits on a lot of coal. There are significant energy poverty issues that need to be addressed. These are all extremely important, but to me it seems to be that the answer lies in developing countries taking the leadership role and seeing the domestic advantages of the energy transition away from fossil fuels in relation to energy security, community energy projects and investment in battery storage and taking that leap. So considering that domestic Indian courts are extremely progressive on environmental issues, do you see at the national level Indian leadership really seizing on the opportunities for renewables, as, for example, China has, and seeing for domestic opportunities to make that transition?
Okay, and then there's a question immediately, the row behind. Yep.
Good afternoon. My name is Zua Matondo. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I'm doing my MPP here at Blavatnik. I just also wanted to push a bit more on India's relationship with Africa. I think very often I can see the narrative is trying to be changed that, you know, India and China are after different things in Africa. But the way I see it, you know, particularly regarding India's growth in the last decade and a bit especially, you know, India is still very much looking to get a lot of Africa's natural resources. And in addition, you know, there's a lot of land grabbing going on by Indian companies. Is the soft power approach simply just another way of acquiring resources from Africa in a way that is a bit less obvious? And how would you advise sort of your future policy makers and diplomats when they interact with the likes of myself in a few years to engage with us in a way that would be mutually beneficial? Thank you.
Fantastic. Great questions. So.
Well, the non-state actors issue, I don't know. It's I can't recall of anything that's would be of great interest to you. But I tell you something that many years ago, when I was a junior minister in Foreign Affairs, I traveled to Geneva for the Human Rights Commission. It was about Kashmir. It was about human rights violations. And we had to defend our record, and we had to find an acceptable level in the declarations. And Pakistan was there vigorously and robustly seeking a very, very stinging declaration. And this was a unique opportunity because I was a junior minister in Mr. Narasimha Rao's government, and the delegation was formally led by the leader of opposition, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who went on to become Prime Minister. We did work for 10 days before he arrived, and the last 2 days before the vote, he was there, and he's, of course, fully briefed, and he did his bit about reaching out to important countries. Those were the days when it wasn't easy to link, provide media links, and that wasn't, there was no internet and so on. And the team that had come from India to cover that was to go back on a flight which was a couple of hours before the actual vote. The vote had got delayed, and they had to leave. And they came to me and said, can we interview you on the result? And I said, but how do you know what the result of the vote's going to be? And he said, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take 2 interviews, one as though you've lost the election, you've lost the vote, and one as though you won the vote. And I said, sure, and then you go back home and you play the wrong film, and I've had it. We would have won the vote here, but when I get back to the country, I will be slaughtered. But it was Mr. Vajpayee who said, doesn't matter, when you have to do things for the country, you have to take the risk. And we sat down and did the interview. Fortunately, there was no vote finally. And therefore, whatever they had taken as the success story was carried on television that night. And Mr. Vajpayee and I both went back as heroes. I lost my election, he became Prime Minister. So that's one story about what happens when you're trying to reach out in negotiations and try to find solutions. But the non-state actor issue is a significant issue. I think we have a lot to learn about dealing with non-state actors. We have non-state actors for us are not independent operatives, but also the track 2 negotiators, NGOs, activists on both sides, including in your own country. And I think we haven't yet got the confidence to deal with them in the way that they deserve to be in terms of responding to their methods and responding to their ideas. I think we need to be a little more self-confident about ourselves and take them on board, because they can sometimes provide critical inputs which could make a difference. But I think we are a bit deficient in this manner. On Africa, I am a little surprised that you say that. I thought the largest Indian outlay in the foreign ministry for development projects that we do is for Africa. The largest number of diplomats and officials that we train are from Africa. And we are proud. We are proud of the work that they've done and the connectivity they've provided with India. And I never tire of telling people that my discussions with several African presidents, including the president of Zimbabwe, when I sat and talked to him in a huge palace, white palace that was built by the Chinese, and I was there to go and push for the Indian point of view. He pointed to something in front of him and said, "You know what that is?" And I said, "That looks like an Indian samosa." And he said, "No, this is an African samosa. We only borrowed it from you, but now it's an African samosa." And I said, "Why are you telling me about this?" And he said, "I want to tell you how strong the relationship between Africa and India is." And he then said that the Chinese come and go, and they bring machinery, and they bring their labor, and they pick up what they need and go. But Indians come here to stay, and they are part of Africa. And you know who my maths teacher was? He was an Indian. And I felt very good, and I felt very encouraged and comforted. And frankly, there's a lot of private sector going to Africa, and I think what you're saying might be something that has happened in some cases. And I would be very sorry if that's how it has happened, because Africa has been very hospitable. Africa has been a great, great friend. We have not always been able to do as much as we want to do for Africa, but we put Africa in a high priority in our policies, and therefore we have a special fund in India called the Africa Fund. But I agree that we can do more. We can do more, and we will indeed offer it in a manner which is quite different from the way China offers. China is more professional. China is more businesslike. We have more of a family approach and a family attitude, because half the people I meet in England are people who come from India originally and then come to Africa, and from Africa they've come to England. And our former Chief Justice in our country, who retired only 4 or 5 months ago, was an Indian who returned from Africa and then became Chief Justice of India, Sikh gentleman. So if there are such aberrations, I would be certainly very sorry, and if you would bring them to our knowledge, we would try and take corrective steps. I know there are some cases that go wrong, but that's not our perception and approach towards what our relationship with Africa has to be. You have indeed been very, very important partners for us in our view of the world, and I would be very sorry if that was in any way diluted or in any way adulterated. On climate change, thank you. It's a tough thing. It's a very tough thing for us. I don't know what we can do to push the issue of climate change. But you know, there is something wrong in the world today. What I see happening in Iraq and Syria with children particularly, the kind of casualties that we see every day, and the number of children who are dying because the world just doesn't seem to be caring enough. There's so much fatigue against interventions and such unwillingness from countries to see body bags that we allow a greater number of deaths to happen simply because we are preventing a few of our own deaths taking place. But I just wish that the world would sit up and pay attention to crises like these, including climate change. And climate change is a crisis that will overtake us in a manner that's unthinkable and unimaginable. Who in the world can take the initiative? I hope there are some very, very effective and very determined people in our country who are addressing this issue repeatedly, consistently, but that it should receive greater attention higher up in the country is something that I would endorse. And I believe India has a major role to play, and India should. And if it meant getting into an argument with President Trump, we should do it.
Well, concretely, just to pick up on that, would it involve cutting back on India's use of coal?
Well, see, you can. We're trying to do it in any case. We are trying to do it in any case. India has a huge program for solar energy, for cutting down on coal. But we have a serious crisis on our hands. Our rivers are drying up. The hydropower, therefore, on which we depended heavily is getting depleted. Our population doesn't permit for major dams to be built. We keep fluctuating from one end to the other. So the dependence on coal, frankly, is almost a compulsion. And there are limits to funding that we can find. So while in principle I agree to what you're saying and would be happy to commit to you that we would do something, fortunately we are not in government, and all we need to do is to convey this commitment to the government to say that this is what people expect of us. Please do something.
Great. Let's take another round. We got a question over there.
Thank you, sir, for your fascinating talk. I'm Jyotsna Mehra. I'm also doing Modern South Asian Studies at St. Anthony's College. So in the last few years, India has been trying to project power beyond its immediate neighborhood, Central Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia. While these, so it's been building land infrastructure and enhancing trade. While these are looked at very positively within India, the host countries realize that there is an obvious gap between rhetoric and output. So you mentioned that we need a genuinely committed leadership. But do you also think that we need reforms in bureaucracy and foreign services so that we're able to deliver better?
Okay, great. We got a question right up front here. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Leo. I come from Canada. And I would like to ask you a question about local...
And you're an MPP student here.
And I'm an MPP student, sorry, yes. Proud of it. I would like to ask you a question about the local politics. Do you think the Congress Party could win the next election that I think are coming up in a year? And if so, what type of issue you think could trigger the fall of Modi? Or do you think what type of issue the Congress Party could use in order to win the next election?
Okay, and we had a question all the way in the back there, Shaz.
Salam, Salman sir. Thank you for your talk. My name is Shazil. I'm from Pakistan. I'm also a student at Blavatnik here. Just to touch upon the Kashmir issue once again, if we can. We had President Azad Kashmir talk at Oxford a few days ago, and he said that that issue should be resolved by the people of Kashmir. And he spoke about a referendum. Would you be in favor of a referendum? And if not, why not?
Okay, so bureaucratic reforms?
Yeah, bureaucratic reform is something that something that's long overdue in our country. We have the Administrative Reforms Commission, given its report, there 21 volumes, I think, or 22 volumes. It would require 5 years to read and therefore nobody has gone back to them. We were at least making an effort to read them. Mr. Moily, who was the leading light in producing those volumes. Now, one hardly needs to strain one's imagination to know that those 21 volumes must have been written by bureaucrats. I can't see any politician writing 21 volumes. And the bureaucrats must have written 21 volumes on the assumption that if you write 21 volumes, nobody will read them. And if nobody reads them, no harm will come to us. So I think what we need is a couple of clever bureaucrats who would reduce the 21 volumes into one volume and then say, we're going to implement this. It's long overdue. There are many elements in bureaucratic reform that have to be considered, that bureaucrats should not necessarily come from one source, that there should be lateral entry. We've tried it at various times in governance. We've tried lateral entries, first right at the top, then in the middle. We've tried sometimes to follow the British model of letting people opt out of bureaucracy and going into private sector and then returning to private sector. Unfortunately, the problem in our country about corruption, and corruption not just in terms of what it really is, but what it is perceived to be. There is an important and a very irksome presumption of corruption in our country, that anyone who works hard may be doing it because he's corrupt. Anyone who took an innovative position and took a quick decision may have done it because he's corrupt. I think more than anything, we need reform of our corruption law. That if somebody can be found corrupt and should be found corrupt, they must be quickly brought to justice, not in 20 years, but not even in 20 months, and then significantly punished. I find in many cases of improper conduct in the United States of America, people get convicted, they get punished, and within years you hear them giving interviews, expressing deep remorse at what has happened, and then subscribing to a new way of life. In our country, many people who get convicted continue to claim that it was wrongly done and that it was done for political reasons, etc. So unless your system can convince the wrongdoer that he has been rightly compelled to be convicted or compelled to face sanctions, I think that system is a great failure. So I think this the method by which we evaluate performance and we make people accountable for unwholesome conduct and behavior is something that needs to be addressed first of all, so that you don't kill initiative in the name of corruption, but don't allow corruption to cast a vast shadow on how you work. And yes, I think any future government should be proposing that bureaucratic reform is absolutely necessary and would be given the highest priority.
Leo, on the next election, and the chances of the Congress Party.
Do you expect me to say that we won't win? That's just inviting trouble from the Republic channel, saying they finally conceded. Now the country knows that finally succeeded. I think there's a very good chance for us to win the next election. When I say for us to win the next election, I'll explain that in just a moment. But the indications that have come in some by-polls, for instance, in Rajasthan, in Madhya Pradesh, and even the results of Gujarat, have kind of turned the sense in the country of what was happening. And I think it's a clear indication that it's not a one-way street, that there will be a reversal much of the tendencies that we saw in 2014. But it's a little bit early to say that there would be a radical change by 2019 for a single party to win. Even BJP, when it came on a huge wave of popularity in 2014, had actually come as an alliance. They came as an alliance, the NDA. They didn't come as a BJP, although BJP was the engine of that alliance and led from the front. I believe that 2019 is also going to be alliance versus alliance, a weakened BJP alliance, because some of their alliance partners are not really very happy. They're not so unhappy that they will join us. I imagine that they will fight on their own. But there are others who would join us, and they ought to join us. And if we put up a decent alliance, I think it'll be the end of the story for the BJP. Of the BJP under Mr. Modi, it may be that the BJP itself has a life after Mr. Modi, as it must in a democracy. But I think it's too early to say and sound arrogant that we will win. There is a lot of work to do. And for me, I personally think that in order to win an election, you must first understand why you lost the last election. I don't think we've entirely been able to do a good analysis of why we lost the last election. There are broadly here and there we know this is what went wrong, that's what went wrong. But to get a deep analysis to understand why you lost the election is important before you actually work out your strategy and plan of winning the next election. And I hope that this is something that's underway, that's going on now, and I hope that this will manifest itself in the months to come.
Okay, and we have a final question in the back there about a referendum in Kashmir.
A referendum in Kashmir. We've never accepted the idea of referendum. And let me just say that that's nothing to do with Kashmir. We don't subscribe to the idea of referendum on anything. I mean, even on important political issues, we think that referendums are not the best answers. And I think people sitting here in the UK experiencing what Brexit has done would perhaps go along, and some friends from Canada would say the same thing, that a referendum is too permanent and too much of a final thing, unlike an election that can be changed 5 years or 3 years down the road. A referendum is something that is too final and almost impossible to reverse. Therefore, it's a problematic thing in our understanding of democracy. The other point about a referendum is the deficiencies of an electoral system, that you don't really know what you're voting for. A referendum can often depend on the question that is put to you, and it can go either way. And if there's to be a referendum on Kashmir, why not a referendum on the Babri Masjid? Why not a referendum on the idea of India? Why not a referendum on whether some people should be excluded from equal citizenship? I think that's just theoretically and in principle, that is a very, very difficult thing to accept. I can understand that people who feel passionately, politically, might say that that's a solution to our problems. But a solution to a problem of one segment of our country's population shouldn't unleash problems for other segments as well. And therefore, traditionally, consistently, and constitutionally, we haven't really accepted the idea of referendums for anything. And it seems unlikely that it will happen there. There are lots of specific issues that one can raise, as people have raised about referendum resolutions of the past, and et cetera, et cetera. But for me, it's too important. Kashmir is too important as part of the description of India and the idea of India to let go under any circumstances. I think it's important that we work towards a wholesome solution in which everybody is happy, India's happy, Pakistan's happy, and Kashmiris are happy. I think that's what should be our ultimate game.
So we've covered a lot of ground. We're running out of time, heavy and heady questions. So I'd like to end on an optimistic note. You've spent about 4 decades in public service, and we're a school of leadership development. What have you learned about the human condition that makes you most optimistic for the future?
Well, what have I learned? I've learned that human beings are like the human body. There's an inbuilt system that heals. It may leave a scar, and therefore you need plastic surgery at times, but it heals. All you can do is to help through surgery or through medication. You can help the body heal itself quickly. But if the body doesn't have a system to heal itself, there is nothing that you can do with surgery and with medical attention. The system from within is programmed to heal itself. It takes time, but it does heal. And I do believe that is true about societies, that's true about humanity, that's true about our lives, and it's true about our politics. But often, in order to heal, you need to rest it. You need to give it the right medicine. You need to give it the right kind of food, right nourishment, and keep it away from toxics. That's what you need, and that's what statesmanship and politics is all about.
Fantastic. Mr. Salman Khurshid, a distinguished graduate of Oxford University. Delighted to have you back here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So we take this off, yeah.